The night Bumpy Johnson realized his own protection had become his greatest threat. Harlem went quiet in a way it never did. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that warned blood was close. It started with a single step out of line. The bodyguard stood half a pace too far forward, blocking Bumpy's view instead of protecting it. In another room, with another man, that might have meant nothing. In Bumpy Johnson's world, it meant everything. The card game froze. Cigarette smoke hung low over the green felt table inside the brownstone off 131st Street, the kind of smoke that soaked into walls and never left. Money lay scattered in neat, disciplined stacks. No wild bets, no sloppy hands. Harlem's order didn't come from chaos. It came from men who understood restraint. Bumpy Johnson sat at the head of the table, posture relaxed, hands folded, eyes steady. He didn't look angry. That was the mistake men always made. They thought anger came first. Across the room, the bodyguard, known on the street as Slim Curtis, shifted his weight again. His coat was unbuttoned. His hand hovered too close to his waistband. And for the first time in years, Bumpy Johnson was not the one controlling the room. Bumpy lifted his eyes, not to Slim, but past him, toward the men watching, the lieutenants who had built their lives around the assumption that loyalty was fixed, not flexible. "You're standing in my line," Bumpy said calmly. Slim didn't move. That silence, the refusal to correct himself, was louder than a gunshot. Every man in the room understood what that moment meant. A bodyguard's job was simple: protect the principal, obey without question, disappear into the background. The moment a protector asserted presence, he crossed from shield to rival. Bumpy leaned back in his chair. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He didn't reach for a weapon. He studied the man who had sworn to take bullets for him and saw something else instead. Ambition. And ambition, in Harlem, had a body count. No one spoke. No one breathed too loudly. Because everyone there knew one truth. Whatever happened next would not stay inside that room. It would ripple through Harlem's streets, its politics, its underworld alliances. History had a way of pivoting on moments that looked small to outsiders. This was one of those moments, and Bumpy Johnson felt it. Years earlier, Harlem had learned what kind of man Bumpy Johnson was. By the time Slim Curtis entered his orbit, Bumpy was already more than a gangster. He was an institution. A negotiator, a force that both Italian mobs and New York politicians preferred to deal with rather than fight. Harlem in the 1930s and 40s was a city within a city. Black-owned businesses pressed against segregated boundaries, jazz pouring out of basements and ballrooms, ambition everywhere and opportunity rationed. Power was something men took quietly or lost loudly. Bumpy Johnson took it quietly. He didn't rule through chaos. He ruled through understanding, of people, of pressure, of consequences. He read philosophy in prison, memorized poetry, and quoted Marcus Aurelius with the same ease other men quoted street gossip. That combination unsettled his enemies. They never knew which version of him they were facing. To Harlem, he was protection. To rivals, he was inevitability. To the police, he was a problem that refused to go away. And to men like Slim Curtis, he was opportunity. Slim hadn't grown up with privilege. He came up hard, dock work, street enforcement, muscle for hire before anyone trusted him with proximity to real power. He had size, discipline, and a reputation for keeping his mouth shut. That was why Bumpy brought him close. Loyalty mattered more than intelligence when danger was constant. For years, Slim did his job well. Too well. He walked Bumpy through crowds where other men flinched. He blocked threats before they formed. He handled whispers and warnings, kept certain conversations from reaching certain ears. But Harlem noticed something before Bumpy did. Slim started answering questions meant for Bumpy. Slim started deciding who got access. Slim started acting less like protection and more like presence. In Harlem, presence was currency, and Slim was spending it fast. The streets talked. They always did. Rumors drifted through barbershops and back rooms. Bumpy's muscle thinks he's next in line. Bumpy's getting comfortable. Bumpy's circle isn't as tight as it used to be. Bumpy heard the whispers. He always did. But legends didn't react to rumors. They waited for proof. And proof had just stepped half a pace too far forward. Back in the brownstone, Bumpy finally looked directly at Slim Curtis. Not with anger, with disappointment. "You forget who you work for?" Bumpy asked. Slim swallowed, then straightened. "Just doing my job." That answer, defensive, unnecessary, confirmed everything. Men doing their job didn't need to explain it. The room held its breath. Because now the question wasn't whether Slim had crossed the line, it was how far he'd already gone. And whether Bumpy Johnson would correct it quietly, or make an example Harlem would never forget. The legend didn't move yet, but Harlem could feel it coming. Bumpy Johnson did not resolve problems in the moment they revealed themselves. He cataloged them. That night in the brownstone, after Slim Curtis finally stepped back into place and the card game resumed, Bumpy played his hand with the same patience he'd shown his entire life. The laughter returned slowly. Cigarettes were relit. Money moved across the table again. But the room had changed, and Slim knew it. He could feel it in the way Bumpy no longer spoke directly to him, in the way instructions were given through others, in the way eyes followed Slim when he crossed a room, measuring him not as protection, but as possibility. In Harlem, possibility was dangerous. Bumpy left the game early. Outside, the night air carried the smell of rain and garbage and ambition. He stood on the stoop for a moment, hat low, coat heavy on his shoulders, listening to the city breathe. He didn't look back. Men who looked back weren't ready to move forward. Harlem in those years was balanced on a blade's edge. The Italian mob still controlled most of New York's major rackets, but Harlem was different. It had its own rules, its own economy, its own pressure points. Numbers runners, nightclubs, unions, protection routes. All of it moved through black hands before it ever touched Italian ones. Bumpy Johnson was the bridge. He negotiated with men who didn't respect him, but feared the consequences of ignoring him. He protected Harlem from becoming a free-for-all while ensuring its money kept flowing. That balance required absolute loyalty inside his circle. And Slim Curtis had started to wobble that balance. Within days, subtle things began to surface. A numbers pickup was delayed, not stolen, just late enough to raise questions. A meeting with an Italian intermediary was rescheduled without Bumpy's direct approval. A club owner mentioned Slim's name in a conversation where only Bumpy's should have existed. None of it was proof. All of it was smoke. Bumpy called for information, not confrontation. He spoke to men who had nothing to gain from lying and everything to lose from being wrong. He listened more than he talked. He tested stories by letting them sit. And slowly, a picture formed. Slim Curtis wasn't making moves against Bumpy. He was making moves around him, establishing relationships, creating obligations, letting people imagine a future where Slim's presence mattered more than Bumpy's approval. That kind of ambition didn't announce itself as betrayal. It introduced itself as insurance. Bumpy understood that better than anyone. He had once been the young man standing too close to power, watching how it moved, learning where it bent. The difference was simple. Bumpy never forgot who built the table. Slim Curtis was starting to believe he could rearrange the chairs. The real challenge came not from Slim himself, but from the way others began to treat him. At a gathering in a Lenox Avenue back room, a respected lieutenant deferred to Slim on a security decision. It was minor, practical, almost invisible. But Bumpy noticed. Later that night, as they walked out together, Bumpy stopped short beneath a flickering street lamp. "You don't answer to him," Bumpy said to the lieutenant, voice even. The man froze. "Wasn't like that, Bump. Just thought..." "Thought what?" The lieutenant hesitated. That hesitation was the answer. Bumpy nodded once. "Don't do it again." The message spread faster than any order ever could. Harlem's ecosystem was sensitive. When power shifted, even slightly, men adjusted their behavior to survive it. And Slim Curtis felt that adjustment like a current. Some men smiled at him longer. Some spoke more freely. Some asked questions that sounded casual but weren't. Slim didn't shut them down. That was his second mistake. For Slim, it had started as survival. Being close to Bumpy meant proximity to danger, police pressure, rival crews, internal politics that chewed men up without warning. Slim told himself he was just making sure he wasn't left exposed if things went bad. But power didn't care about intentions. It responded to actions, and Slim's actions were beginning to look like preparation. The police noticed too. A plainclothes detective named Callahan, assigned to Harlem for longer than he cared to admit, started hearing Slim's name where it didn't belong. Callahan wasn't a crusader. He was a realist. He knew Bumpy Johnson wasn't going anywhere. But fractures? Fractures were opportunities. Callahan made a point of being seen near Slim. A nod here. A harmless question there. Nothing explicit. Nothing provable. Slim didn't cooperate, but he didn't shut it down either. In that space between refusal and rejection, danger grew. Bumpy Johnson finally made his move, not against Slim, but around him. He reassigned protection routes, shifted meeting times, let Slim feel what it was like to be close, but not central, trusted, but not informed. It was a test. Men who valued loyalty corrected themselves when faced with distance. Men who valued power filled the gap. Slim filled it. He started bringing his own people closer. Men who answered to him first, Bumpy second. Quiet men. Capable men. Men who didn't ask questions. That was when Bumpy knew. Not because Slim had betrayed him, but because Slim was preparing for a world where betrayal would be necessary. And in Harlem, necessity had a way of becoming justification. The challenge was no longer theoretical. It was structural. And if Bumpy didn't address it, Harlem would. Violently. The tension reached its breaking point on a Sunday afternoon. A church fundraiser. Public. Respectable. Politicians present. Community leaders shaking hands and smiling for cameras. The kind of place where violence was unthinkable, and therefore most dangerous. Bumpy arrived late, as he often did. Slim Curtis was already there, standing too close to the front, greeting people like a host. When Slim saw Bumpy enter, there was a half second, just a half, where he didn't step aside. It was instinctive and irreversible. Bumpy stopped. The room didn't know why it had gone quiet, but Harlem did. Because this time, Slim hadn't crossed the line in private. He'd crossed it in front of witnesses. And Bumpy Johnson understood one unbreakable rule of power. What is challenged in public must be answered in kind. The legend met Slim's eyes. No anger, no warning, just certainty. Whatever happened next would not be subtle, and it would not be forgiven. The church basement smelled of coffee, starch, and nervous respect. Folding chairs lined the walls. A gospel record played softly from a phonograph in the corner. On the surface, it was nothing more than a community fundraiser. Donations collected in envelopes, handshakes exchanged with careful smiles. But Harlem understood layers, and beneath the hymns and polite applause, power moved the same way it always had. Bumpy Johnson stood just inside the doorway, coat buttoned, hat still on his head. Slim Curtis stood 10 feet away, frozen mid-greeting, his hand still extended toward a city councilman who suddenly found the floor far more interesting than the conversation. That half-second of hesitation hung between them like a verdict. Then, Slim stepped aside. Too late. Bumpy walked past him without acknowledgement. Not a glance, not a word. That, in Harlem, was worse than a confrontation. Because silence from a legend was never empty. It was loaded. Men watching understood what had just happened. Slim Curtis had been publicly marked, not as an enemy, not yet, but as a question. And unanswered questions in Harlem made men nervous. After the fundraiser, Bumpy didn't summon Slim. He didn't scold him. He didn't even change his routine. That restraint was deliberate. Bumpy had learned long ago that men who were testing limits often revealed themselves fully when they believed they were getting away with it. Confrontation too early forced denials. Patience forced mistakes. Slim, emboldened by survival, made plenty. Within a week, Bumpy received word that Slim had sat in on a numbers dispute he had no authority to handle. Within 2, Slim had intervened in a club disagreement using Bumpy's name, but without his permission. Still no direct challenge, just erosion. Bumpy listened, took notes in his head, compared sources, verified timelines. Every story pointed in the same direction. Slim Curtis wasn't trying to overthrow Bumpy. He was trying to replace him slowly enough that no one noticed when it happened. That kind of ambition was the most dangerous of all. The Italians noticed before the police did. A messenger from one of Lucky Luciano's remaining Harlem intermediaries requested a meeting. Neutral ground, short notice, no theatrics. Bumpy agreed. The meeting took place in a quiet back room of a restaurant that served no black customers, except the ones Italians needed to speak to discreetly. Bumpy arrived alone. The intermediary was polite, careful, almost apologetic. "There's talk," the man said, hands folded. "Not from us, from others." Bumpy waited. "Your man," the intermediary continued. "Slim. He's been offering reassurances." That was confirmation. "What kind of reassurances?" Bumpy asked. "That business will continue smoothly, that any future disruptions will be handled, that he understands our concerns." Bumpy nodded slowly. "And you believe him?" The intermediary hesitated. "We believe he believes himself." That was enough. Bumpy stood, adjusted his coat. "There won't be any disruptions," he said, "from anyone." The intermediary swallowed. Of course. When Bumpy left, the decision was already made. Not in anger, in necessity. Back in Harlem, Bumpy called a private meeting, not with Slim, but without him. Only his oldest lieutenants attended, men who had stood with him through prison stints, blood feuds, and political pressure. Men who understood that leadership was not performance, it was responsibility. "Some of you have noticed changes," Bumpy said. "Some of you have been approached." No one denied it. Bumpy looked at each man in turn. "If anyone here believes I'm slipping, now's the time to say it." Silence. Not fearful, respectful. Bumpy nodded. "Then we're clear." One lieutenant spoke. "What about Slim?" Bumpy paused. "Slim's forgotten his place." That was all. No orders yet, because Bumpy Johnson did not rush justice. Slim Curtis felt the shift before he understood it. Phone calls went unanswered. Meetings were rescheduled without explanation. Men he trusted suddenly had excuses. Others watched him too closely. He tried to correct it by asserting more presence, showing up early, speaking confidently, reminding people of his role. Each attempt made things worse. Finally, he asked for a meeting. Bumpy agreed. The meeting was set for a quiet afternoon in an office above a closed-down storefront. No audience, no witnesses beyond necessity. Slim arrived early. He stood by the window, watching Harlem move below him, and for the first time felt something like regret. Not for ambition, but for timing. When Bumpy entered, Slim straightened immediately. They sat across from each other, a small desk between them. "You wanted to talk," Bumpy said. Slim nodded. "Feels like things been changing." Bumpy waited. "I've always been loyal," Slim continued. "Everything I did for you." Bumpy studied him. "Did I ask you to do those things?" Bumpy asked. Slim hesitated. "No, but I thought—" "That's where you went wrong," Bumpy said quietly. Slim leaned forward. "I was protecting the operation. You were protecting yourself." The words landed clean, unemotional, final. Slim's jaw tightened. "I didn't betray you." Bumpy nodded. "Not yet." That was the line Slim couldn't cross back over. "What happens now?" Slim asked. Bumpy stood. "Now," he said, You decide how this ends." Slim looked up, searching for something. Anger, mercy, negotiation. He found none. Only certainty. Bumpy turned to leave, then stopped. "One more thing," he said. "Don't put yourself in my way again." The door closed. Slim sat alone, heart pounding, understanding too late what he'd mistaken for tolerance. The challenge was over. The confrontation was coming. And Harlem was about to learn what happened when a bodyguard forgot he was meant to stand behind the legend, not beside him. The mistake Slim Curtis made wasn't thinking he could rise. It was believing Bumpy Johnson would stop him violently. Men who expected explosions prepared for chaos. Men who understood Bumpy prepared for silence. Slim chose the wrong preparation. 3 nights after their private meeting, Slim made his final move. Not against Bumpy directly, but against the structure Bumpy had built. He arranged a private sit-down with 2 mid-level lieutenants and a numbers banker who'd grown impatient with Bumpy's caution. Slim framed it carefully. "He's tired," Slim said. "Still sharp, but slower. Harlem's changing. We can keep things steady without drawing heat." He didn't say replace. He didn't have to. One of the lieutenants asked the only question that mattered. "What happens when Bumpy finds out?" Slim smiled, a tight, rehearsed thing. "By then, there won't be anything to find out." That sentence sealed his fate. Because the room already had a listener. Not a spy, a survivor. The banker, a man who'd watched power change hands too many times to gamble on ambition, left early and walked straight to a phone booth on 125th Street. He made one call. And when Bumpy Johnson heard Slim's words repeated back to him, he didn't interrupt once. When the banker finished, Bumpy said only this: "Thank you for your honesty." Then he hung up. The confrontation was scheduled for the following evening. Neutral ground, but not public. A closed jazz club on 7th Avenue, shut down temporarily for renovations. The kind of place where sounds stayed inside and secrets didn't travel. Slim was told it was a routine security discussion. He arrived with 2 men. Bumpy arrived alone. That detail should have warned Slim. Inside, the club was dim, chairs stacked, stage lights off. The only illumination came from a single hanging bulb above a small table near the bar. Bumpy stood beside it. Slim stopped a few feet away. "You brought company," Bumpy said calmly. Slim gestured to his men. "Just precaution." Bumpy nodded. "That tells me what I need to know." Slim stiffened. "I didn't come here to fight." "No," Bumpy said. "You came to decide." Slim exhaled slowly. "Things are moving whether you like it or not. I was trying to keep it clean." Bumpy stepped closer. "For who?" he asked. Slim held his ground. "For Harlem." That earned Slim his first reaction from Bumpy. A short laugh. Soft. Almost sad. "You don't speak for Harlem," Bumpy said. "You never did." Slim's voice hardened. "I kept you alive." "You stood in front of bullets meant for me," Bumpy replied. "That's not leadership. That's service." One of Slim's men shifted. Bumpy noticed. "So let's be clear," Bumpy continued. "You didn't protect me so you could replace me. You protected me because I allowed you close." Slim's jaw clenched. "You think I can't take what you have?" Bumpy leaned in just enough for Slim to feel the weight of him. "You already tried," Bumpy said, "and you failed." Slim's hand moved, not to a weapon, to the table. A signal. His men tensed. And that's when the door behind them opened. Not dramatically, casually. 3 of Bumpy's oldest enforcers stepped inside, not armed to the teeth, not aggressive, just present. The room recalibrated instantly. Slim turned, eyes wide. "You said you came alone," he snapped. "I did," Bumpy replied. "They're not here for me." That was the moment Slim understood. This wasn't an execution. It was a reckoning. Bumpy took a seat. "Everyone here knows the rules," he said to the room. "No blood unless it's earned." He looked directly at Slim. "You crossed a line, not with violence, but with intention." Slim swallowed. "I can fix this." "No," Bumpy said, "you can't." Silence pressed in. Bumpy stood again. "You don't die tonight," he said. "That would make you a martyr to men who don't deserve one." Slim blinked. "Then what?" "You leave Harlem," Bumpy said. "Tonight. No speeches, no handshakes, no warnings." Slim shook his head. "That's it?" "That's mercy," Bumpy replied. "Something you didn't earn, but something Harlem doesn't need taken from it." Slim's pride flared. "You think people won't notice?" Bumpy stepped closer. "They already have," he said, "and they chose." Slim looked around. No one met his eyes. Not his men. Not the lieutenants who had arrived quietly and stood in the shadows. Not even the bartender pretending to clean a glass. Power had already moved. Slim straightened his coat. "If I walk out that door," he said, "I won't be the only one who remembers this." Bumpy nodded. History always remembers. Slim took one step back, then another. At the door he stopped. "You made a mistake." Bumpy didn't respond. The door closed, and with it, Slim Curtis's future in Harlem. No shots were fired. No bodies fell. And yet, by morning, every corner of Harlem knew exactly what had happened. Slim Curtis was gone. Not arrested, not buried. Erased. And that kind of disappearance carried more weight than violence ever could. By sunrise, Harlem had already adjusted. That was the first thing Bumpy Johnson noticed as he walked his usual route past 125th Street. No confusion, no scrambling, no panic. Just a subtle collective recalibration, the way a seasoned city corrected its posture after a long-held tension finally released. Slim Curtis's name wasn't spoken. It didn't need to be. Men who had once waited for Slim's nod now waited for Bumpy's glance. Club owners who'd hedged their conversations corrected themselves mid-sentence. Numbers runners returned to established routes without being told. Order had reasserted itself. Not through fear, through clarity. Bumpy stopped at a corner where two young men argued over territory. Nothing serious, just posturing. One of them recognized Bumpy immediately and lowered his voice. "Morning, Mr. Johnson." Bumpy nodded and kept walking. That small moment told him everything he needed to know. The police heard too. Detective Callahan read the street the same way he always had, with patience and frustration. Slim Curtis had been on his radar as a potential wedge, a man who might talk if pressure was applied carefully enough. But pressure required instability, and instability had vanished overnight. Callahan asked around. Got nothing. No arrests, no incidents, no visible violence. Just the quiet understanding that Slim Curtis was no longer a factor. That kind of outcome irritated law enforcement more than open warfare ever could. You couldn't arrest silence. The Italians reached out next, not with demands, with acknowledgement. A short message made its way to Bumpy through familiar channels. Business continues. Respect remains. That was as close to an apology as power ever offered. Bumpy received it without satisfaction. He hadn't acted for recognition. He'd acted because leadership demanded it. Slim Curtis, meanwhile, rode a southbound train before noon. No entourage, no protection. Just a single suitcase and a future narrowed down to survival. He didn't look out the window as Harlem disappeared behind him, because some men didn't need reminders of what they'd lost. The lesson wasn't that ambition was punished. It was that ambition without loyalty was exile. Within Bumpy's circle, the consequences were precise. Two men who had entertained Slim's conversations were quietly reassigned to lesser roles. No humiliation, no confrontation, just distance. They accepted it, because they understood the alternative. Bumpy didn't lecture them. He didn't demand confessions. He let the outcome speak. Power, when exercised correctly, didn't need explanation. At a private gathering a week later, One of Bumpy's oldest lieutenants finally spoke the question everyone had been carrying. "You could have ended him," the man said. "Nobody would have blamed you." Bumpy poured himself a drink, took his time. "Ending him would have been easy," Bumpy said. "Leading after that would have been harder." The men around him nodded, because leadership wasn't about removing threats, it was about reinforcing standards. The community felt it too, not in dramatic ways, in subtle ones. Shop owners reopened a little earlier, church collections grew steadier, street disputes de-escalated faster. Harlem breathed easier when it knew who held the line. Bumpy attended another fundraiser 2 Sundays later. Same church, same basement. This time, when he entered, the room adjusted naturally. Chairs shifted. Conversations paused, not out of fear, but out of respect. Bumpy removed his hat. He saw no slim Curtis-shaped gap, just space where certainty lived again. What happened between Bumpy Johnson and his bodyguard never became official record. There were no police reports, no headlines, no court documents. But Harlem didn't need paperwork to understand history. Men remembered where Slim used to stand, and where he no longer did. That absence taught more than violence ever could. Bumpy Johnson didn't celebrate. He returned to work. Meetings resumed. Negotiations continued. Pressure mounted as it always did. Power didn't pause for reflection. But something had shifted. Not outwardly. Inwardly. Men around Bumpy moved with renewed clarity. Boundaries were sharper. Roles were respected. The lesson had landed clean. You could be close to the legend. You could serve him. But you could never mistake proximity for entitlement. Late one evening, Bumpy stood alone outside the same closed jazz club where the confrontation had taken place. The renovations were over. Music drifted into the street again. A trumpet cried softly. Life continued. That was the point. Bumpy adjusted his coat and walked on, leaving the past where it belonged. Not buried, not denied. Resolved. Years later, men would argue about when Bumpy Johnson truly became untouchable. Some pointed to his negotiations with the Italians, others to his prison stints, and the way he returned each time sharper, never diminished. A few traced it back to the night he stared down police captains and walked free on technicalities that still embarrassed the courts. But in Harlem, the elders told it differently. They said it was the year Bumpy Johnson removed a threat without spilling a drop of blood. The year he proved that power didn't need spectacle to be absolute. Slim Curtis became a footnote, a cautionary name whispered to young men who mistook access for authority. No one ever confirmed where he landed. Some said Chicago, others said down south. A few claimed he tried to start over and failed quietly. Wherever he went, he carried Harlem's lesson with him. You didn't challenge a system built on respect unless you were ready to live without it. Bumpy's reputation hardened after that, not as a tyrant, as a final word. Men understood that if Bumpy allowed you close, it was because he trusted you, not because he needed you. That distinction shaped every interaction that followed. Police captains negotiated more carefully. Politicians watched their tone. Rival crews measured their steps twice. Because the man who could end a betrayal without bloodshed was not a man you rushed. He was a man you studied. Harlem itself benefited. The absence of internal war preserved businesses, families, futures. Young men saw a version of leadership that didn't glorify chaos. Old men slept easier knowing disputes ended with decisions, not funerals. Bumpy didn't preach that lesson. He embodied it, and that made it durable. In later years, when journalists and writers tried to reduce him to a caricature, a gangster, a criminal, a relic, Harlem pushed back in its own quiet way. They spoke of nights that didn't turn violent because Bumpy said no, of deals that protected neighborhoods from exploitation, of moments when restraint saved lives. And sometimes, when trust was discussed, someone would mention the bodyguard who crossed the line. Not with anger, with understanding. That story became part of Harlem's oral history, not as gossip, but as instruction. It taught that loyalty was not silence, but alignment. That ambition wasn't wrong, but it had to respect structure. and that the most dangerous mistake a man could make was believing the legend needed him more than the system needed the legend. Bumpy Johnson aged into his power. He walked slower, spoke less, listened more. But men still stepped aside when he entered a room, not because they feared him, but because they recognized what he represented. Continuity, dignity, control without cruelty. The night Slim Curtis left Harlem, nothing burned. No sirens wailed, no mothers cried. That absence became the evidence. Years later, when younger men asked why things were the way they were, elders didn't point to gunfights or blood-soaked streets. They pointed to discipline, to leadership, to the night a bodyguard crossed the line, and the legend corrected history without letting it fracture. Bumpy Johnson never wrote his own legacy, but Harlem did, in the way it survived, in the way it held together, in the way it remembered who had the strength to end a threat, and the wisdom not to become one. This story was never just about a bodyguard who wanted more. It was about the moment power was tested, not with violence, but with temptation. Slim Curtis didn't fall because he was weak. He fell because he confused access with authority, proximity with permission. And in Harlem, those mistakes had consequences long before they ever made headlines. Bumpy Johnson understood something few men ever do. Real power doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't rush, and it doesn't panic when challenged. When his own protection crossed the line, Bumpy didn't reach for a gun. He reached for order. He chose stability over spectacle, leadership over ego. And in doing so, he reminded Harlem, and everyone watching from the edges, what respect truly looked like. Because this wasn't just about one man's ambition. It was about a community that couldn't afford internal collapse. It was about a leader who knew that spilling blood was easy, but preventing it took strength. History often celebrates the loud moments, the gunshots, the riots, the explosions of rage. But the moments that shape communities are quieter. They happen behind closed doors, in rooms where decisions are made carefully, deliberately, and with consequences that last generations. That night, when Bumpy Johnson let a traitor walk away instead of burying him, Harlem didn't see weakness. It saw discipline. And discipline is what separates legends from cautionary tales. Because in the end, anyone can pull a trigger. But only a legend knows when not to. And that restraint, more than violence, more than fear, is why Bumpy Johnson's name still carries weight long after the streets he ruled have changed. Not because he took lives, but because he knew how to protect them.